that helps organisations as well as individuals trying to get the most out of their garden. And as you can probably guess, and if you don't know me beforehand, you'll know that I'm fairly passionate about trying to pass on as much information as I can to try and help and assist people become as successful in their gardens. So we're going to talk about, let's talk about some statistics and some of the reasons why we probably should be composting more than we do. You know, up to about half of everything in people's household bins these days on average, not only just the food waste, but all the other stuff that gets thrown out is compostable material. And here in Australia, Australians are sending over 5.3 million tonnes of food waste to landfill every year, which is just, it's mind-blowing when you think about just how much we're throwing in our bins. And unfortunately, it generally equates, you know, to things that we're throwing out due to poor meal planning, you know, not using leftovers, you know, and putting the scraps and so forth and sending them to landfill rather than be actually using what we're throwing out. And it's a really valuable resource, and I don't think a lot of people understand just how valuable it is. You know, the staggering statistic is that 298 kilos of food per person is what we're throwing out per year, which is mind-blowing, really. When you send this sort of stuff in mass to landfill, what happens is that anaerobically it decomposes, which produces a methane gas, which obviously contributes to the greenhouse gases and the carbon emissions that we're putting up into the atmosphere, which ultimately, you know, is causing us globally a fairly big problem. So we all, you know, whilst we look at these figures and think, geez, you know, I'm only just one person, what can I really do about, you know, changing all of that? Well, actually, you can. And if we start and educate one another and we do our small little bit, small amounts can make big changes when everyone starts to do this. And look, most councils today are actively involved in encouraging and running initiatives to get people to worm farm and to reduce what they're putting to landfill. So, so today we'll go through some of what can go into the compost bins and stuff that can't go into the compost bins, but along also with how you would easily set up something, you know, depending upon your space and where you live, and how convenient this can be for you to be able to do. So, yeah, you know, the before and after scenario, you know, when you're throwing stuff in compost, it's a good idea to start and chop it up before you put it in the bin. And I have a compost bin in my kitchen. It's got a lid on it, and some councils supply them to you free. Some of them will provide them at a reduced price. They subsidise them, and if not, you can use a container with just a snap-on lid. So rather than take out, you know, each, you know, you're peeling potatoes and so forth, you know, have that beside your cutting board and just simply put the scraps of what you're chopping up into the bin, and then you can leave that there a day or two without any problem whatsoever. And then when you get the time to take it out and put it into a compost bin or some sort of receptacle that you're using to become your compost area. And I'll go through the things or the different types of composting receptacles or things you can do. You don't even actually necessarily need to have a compost bin. I can remember when I was growing up in Glenroy, my father actually just had a compost heap. He just used to pile it up into a small mound, and he would put a cover over the top of it, just a tarpaulin over the top, and that used to work fine. So the wonderful thing about compost is that it turns organic matter into soil, and realistically, organic matter, soil is made up from compost, and it's what organic matter material turns into after it's been broken down. You know, composting things like grass clippings and small prunings, weeds for food scraps, weeds from and food scraps, eggshells, animal manures, but provided they're not meat-eating animals, so things like cow manure, chick manure, sheep, horse, and the like. That's all good stuff to go into the composting. But it's remarkable what composting turns into, and they say that a good handful of rich organic compost can contain as much microbial activity as there are humans on the earth, which is mind-blowing, really. I mean, mind you, not that I've never ever sat there and counted just how many bacteria there are, and to try and prove them right or wrong. But if I believe what I read, that's an incredible thing. And of course, if you're topping up your garden or your plants with this wonderful material, then you can guarantee that you're always going to get good crops and good results. So, so let's look at what you can put in to a compost, and obviously fruit scraps, vegetable scraps, eggshells, even the egg cartons if you're buying them. I have my own chickens, so I don't get egg cartons, but egg cartons being soaked and torn up can go into the compost. As you can see, is grass and plant clippings and leaves that you raked up, shredded paper, provided it's not heavily inked. You know, glossy magazines don't make for good compost, but certainly newspapers, the local newspaper that you get delivered, and any sort of white or bleached paper is quite okay. Cardboard is also another great resource that you can use to put into the compost. Of course, dried leaves, raking up, particularly when you've got deciduous trees that drop their leaves, and most fruit trees these days, obviously, in backyards drop their leaves, so that's a good resource. Paper towels, napkins, tissues, those sorts of things are okay. And another thing that people, I think, don't perhaps give any consideration to is when, you know, a food product like jams or preserves have passed their are no longer good. You can certainly scrape out and throw those in. You don't want to compost things like meat, fats, oils, or grease. You don't want too much fish waste in there. No dairy products. Now, citrus peels and onions I tend to disagree with. I do, but I chop it up. That's the key to success. The reason that they say not to, they say that it's a bit acidic, but I wouldn't put that in a worm farm, but certainly in a compost, because the worms that go in a worm farm are very different to the worms that you get in a compost. So, and I'll talk about that a bit later on. Diseased plants and so forth. You don't really want to put diseased plants that are carrying molds or those sorts of things. You know, people that have got peaches and nectarines quite often get a disease called curly leaf. I discourage people from putting those raked up leaves in the compost because they drop the spore inside the compost, and of course down the track you use the compost back on your garden, and of course it's got the curly leaf mold spores in the compost, and then of course you basically reinfect the trees again with what you've made in the compost. Coated or glossy papers are not a good thing to use, as I explained before. You know, heavily inked paper and so forth is generally not wise to put in compost, and certainly no animal feces like cats or dogs. That's certainly a no-no, because they are meat eaters as well. Sawdust is also not a good thing to put in there. Certainly wood shavings is different to sawdust, and particularly things like that MDF microfiber, medium density fiberboard that seems to be commonplace these days. You should not be putting that in the compost either. So where to put compost, and just bear with me for a tick while I have my notes. Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning, how are you?
Good, thank you. Sorry I'm late because I just know now.
Oh, that's okay, that's fine. Okay, so you want to choose an area of your yard with a little bit of shade so that the material doesn't dry out too much. So choosing the position is sort of paramount, really. You don't want it out in the really hot sun. So a little bit of shade would be good. So afternoon sun is not so good. But look, in some instances, you're just not going to be able to provide that afternoon shade, and probably there at the community garden, it's probably more likely going to be out in the full sun. So maybe we might talk about keeping a cover over the top of it so that it doesn't get dried out. Of course, knowing what the compost is important. So, and it takes a little bit of time to get used to, you know, what you can and you can't. And I mean, there's a big list, and they're easily downloadable on the internet of what you can and what you can't put in there. And perhaps you should have that if you're going to involve the household. And I guess if you've got people in the house that are either putting stuff in the bin, going to the fridge, and are able to make a decision about whether to throw something out or not, then a good place to have a list like this would be on the fridge in the kitchen, and make it known to people that they should look before they go throwing it in the bin as to where it should go. You know, whether it goes into the recycle bin or it goes into the compost bin or the worm farm bin, would be a good thing to start and encourage people that live in your households to do. Certainly in a workplace where you guys are down there at the community centre, this is something that I would encourage you to do, and make sure that anyone that is down there during the course of the day, you know, when you see them going to put something in the bin that may not necessarily warrant being thrown to landfill, perhaps intervene and suggest that they might consider putting that in the compost, and point to the have this in a location perhaps near the bins, so that they can make their own decisions about what goes where, whether it goes in the recycle bin, the landfill bin, or a compost bin to be later taken out to be composted on site. I think we've probably spent enough time on what to put in and perhaps what not. When you're building compost, it's important to put it in layers. And there's a compost heap that I was talking about before. And make sure that it's labelled, obviously, for those that are working in an environment, not your own backyards, obviously, everyone knows your own compost, but when it's a workplace, make sure people are aware of where the compost heap, bin or compost bay is located, so that they can easily access it. There are a wide variety of different sorts of bins, bays, and that you can use to put together reasonably cheaply. But it's very important to get them layered. It's a bit like building a pizza, and what you want to do is you want to have some high nitrogen and low nitrogen layers, and I recommend that no more than about 10 centimetre layers, and sometimes that means you may need to stockpile some of what you intend to put in the compost because you've got too much of it. So you might have just mowed the lawns, for instance, and you might have, you know, 5 or 6 wheelbarrows full of grass clippings ready to go. Well, I wouldn't put all of that straight into the compost. What I do is I'd set that aside a little bit. So it's good to have a few bays if you've got the room for them, so that you can sort of stockpile what's to go into the compost, one that you're building and one that you're working out of to get some of the wonderful composted material to use on your garden. So 3 bays is what I prefer if I can do that. If it was, for instance, a compost bin, then you might need a heap beside the compost bin, so that you can put these layers together. So you put in a great heap or a 10 centimetre layer of lawn clippings, and then you might have some branches that you've cut up and put in about 100 centimetres, a 10 centimetre layer of the branches all cut up over the top of the lawn clippings, and then you could probably put another layer of lawn clippings if you wanted. But if you've got some food scraps, that's the next thing that I would put on the top of it. So, so high nitrogen, which is the food waste, low nitrogen, which is the branches, the brown material basically, and some carbon, a layer of carbon in there. So the carbon could come in the form of cardboard, egg cartons, the shredded paper. So rather than be putting stuff to recycling, the shredded paper and so forth, that could go into your compost, and believe me, it breaks down quite quickly, and of course makes this wonderful soil. You also need to keep them reasonably moist, but I don't mean by moist, I don't mean sopping wet. There's a bit of a happy medium, and I apply water after each layer when you pile on, so that it's not too wet, and then finish with a little bit of soil or a little bit of compost material over the top of it, just to help with starting to get some of the bacteria that is being active in some finished compost back into the stuff that is only just starting, and that actually helps speed the process up by introducing what live bacteria is. Like I said to you before, 1 handful of finished compost material that we would nearly call soil, it contains billions of bacteria in it. So it'd be really good to get a shovelful of that just lightly sprinkled over the top of that last layer that you've done when you've been putting stuff into the compost, and that, as I say, would certainly help to activate the compost nicely. Remember that the smaller things are, the quicker they decompose. So, for instance, if you throw in a banana peel, it will take, probably somewhere in the order of about 8 to 12 weeks, somewhere in that range, to break down. If you were to cut that up really small, it would only take 4 weeks. So it's remarkable how fast you can get compost made depending upon how you put it together. Now, one of the things that I do, and I haven't got a picture of it here, I'm sorry I don't, but I've got a little tomahawk, a little sharpened axe up near my compost heap. And when I take, it might be pumpkin skins, or it might be watermelon skin, or it could be anything really. I just simply have a block where the tomahawk is, and I just simply chop it up. It's good to take out the week's frustration at the end of the week when you've had enough of everything. Go up the back there with the compost and chop up all the bits and pieces and throw that into your compost. So the smaller you get them, the better, the faster the compost will work. You want to be able to be in a position to turn over your compost reasonably well as well. Now, this is the bay that I'm proposing that you put in at the community garden there. These have been built out of pellets, the timber pellets that you often see the transport companies use. They're relatively cheap, often free, and pretty easy to put together. So there are some star pickets being driven into the ground and screwed to the end of the pallets to hold them up. And they've basically been screwed together at the ones at the back, just sat on the ground. That you don't need any more than that. And the beauty too is that these are really good because they allow the air through into the compost, which is important. You can get some air into them. That's one of the reasons why probably compost bins don't work quite as well as a compost that looks like this, because they don't get as much air as they need, really. So here's an example of what I was talking about before. Look, the bin on the left, which is this one here, is one that is not being worked on, but storing the stuff that is being worked on. It then goes into this one, into the middle, and is getting turned over. And this one's the one that's getting close to being ready. Here's, in a bit more detail, those layers I was talking about. Now, that's not a bad point. See how in the bottom layer they've put in some sticks and some branches? Well, again, I would chop those up nice and fine, but that allows some air to get underneath the compost initially to help, building the layers. And then, of course, they've put in a low nitrogen level of dried leaves and so forth. And then the next level is now a high nitrogen level, a green layer of, be it grass or weeds, or could be food scraps. Next one up is another brown one, so it might be dried leaves and twigs again, maybe a bit of carbon or cardboard. Next one is some food scraps, and so on. So you can see how the layers are built, and really, really important to make sure that you do layer your compost when you build it. Now, I was alluding to the fact before that compost bins need to be aerated, and a garden fork does a great job, but in a compost bin, they're a little bit harder to use. So you can buy these things at most large hardware stores, and or your local nursery, they'll have them. And these are a compost spiral made out of quite thick wire, and you can just simply hold the top handle and rotate it down into the compost and pull that up, so it pulls the bottom to the top and the top to the bottom as you wind it down. So they're a really easy and handy thing to do. And of course, the more you get air into these layers and start to get them mixed up after a few weeks of sitting there composting, doing their thing, the more activity, the more bacterial activity that you'll get happening in your compost. So yeah, so look out for one of those there, and they're not terribly expensive either. Now, when it comes time that your compost is starting to get close to ready, you don't really want all of the matter that hasn't quite broken down yet, and you'll find that quite often in nearly all compost that I've ever made. You have to sort of sift it a little bit. So this guy is made up a frame, and he's just propped up the frame, and what he's doing is he's grabbing shovelfuls of the compost and throwing it against the frame, and all the fine stuff's falling behind the frame onto the ground, ready to be scooped back up, and all the stuff that hasn't broken down yet is falling to the front of it, which he can then pick back up and take back to his compost. So that's a great way of being able to utilise the compost that you're making as you go. So, but you could also make a sift. I can remember my dad had a round sift, and it was pretty heavy too. You put 3 or 4 shovelfuls of compost into the sift, and then you would shake it. You'd certainly keep you fit, I can tell you. And the bottom, you'd shake it over the wheelbarrow, and what you wanted to save would go into the wheelbarrow, and all the stuff that didn't would get thrown back into the compost. So Okay, so we're up to the worm farming side of things. Perhaps what I might do is, if anyone has any questions regarding what I've discussed so far, and I've just pulled up the chat scenario. Is there any prevalence of Queensland fruit fly in this area? So microwave and freeze fallen fruit from the area. Look, that's probably not a bad suggestion. Yes, we have small amounts of fruit fly in pockets of Victoria. If by chance you come across any fruit flies, it's important that you alert the authorities. I know in Moonee Valley, which is a long way short of where you guys are, for over 20 years now, they've had a fruit fly spraying program in the streets, and that's really come about by allowing fruit trees to get far too big. And as the population there have aged and passed on, the demographic is different, that don't really know much about fruit trees. And of course, what's happening is possums and birds and what have you are eating from the fruit that are out of the reach of people to try and pick. And on the winds, the fruit fly have been smelling them and have infested some of the trees down there. So touch wood, it's not a big problem in Victoria, but we don't want it to be either. So if you happen to find opening up fruit and have got larvae in the middle of it that look a bit like maggots, it's time you alerted the authorities. So alert your local council would be a good start. And the Department of Primary Industries is another one that you should be looking at. I have a question here about can we add eggshell? Absolutely, eggshells. To say nothing of the fact that they're a wonderful calcium source for the soil, but they absolutely make a great addition to compost. You can use as much of it as you like. What I do recommend though is that you crunch them up. Make sure that you smash them down a little bit so that you've got nice small bits. So, any more questions while I'm going? How long will it take to be ready? Okay, so that's a good question, and it depends really upon how often you turn it over. Somewhere between 12 to 16 weeks for most compost bins. There is an opportunity for compost base. Just let me flick through these shortly. So here's a hot compost bin. There is a method called hot composting, but they're a lot of work because what you've got to do is you've got to turn these over every day. And for most people, they don't have the time for that. And as you can see here, they get quite hot. It's around about 60 degrees Celsius internally. And you can turn a hot compost over and have it ready in a fortnight, in just 2 weeks. But it has to be turned every day, and it's quite a vigorous thing to try and do. A lot of the big councils utilise this method because they deal with so much waste, but they're turning their compost over with machines, which is a little different to you and I. Most of us don't have the time to get out there with a pitchfork and turn over a cubic metre of compost every day. And if you don't do it every day, you've got a problem. So this is what they're doing here. They lay it out on concrete in mounds like you see, and the machine comes along each day and turns it over. And they mix one with the other, mixing good bacteria with bacteria that hasn't started in the heat out in the sun so that it really does get nice and hot. I don't know whether any of you have dug down into compost before and put your hand in the centre of a piece into a compost heap. I can guarantee you, if you have, you don't leave your hand in there very long because it's quite hot. You'll pull it out quicker than you put it in there, I can assure you. I've nearly been burnt from compost that's extremely hot. So it's remarkable what bacteria does when it starts to to be activated properly. So back to worm farmers. Worm farming is another way of being able to utilise your waste material, and again, most councils are actively encouraging people use them. These also don't take up much room and do go through quite a lot. You sort of think, oh, your compost bin versus worm farm. Believe me, worm farms can go through quite a lot of food in a very short space of time if you get them working correctly. They are also a thing that you can put in your garage. You don't have to have it outside. And in fact, quite often they're good out of the sun. If they're on legs, I generally encourage people to put a little container of water underneath each leg so that you don't get any ants travelling in there. Not that I've ever had too much trouble with ants, but that sometimes can happen, and that's a way around being able to do that. And as you can see here, this is a polystyrene broccoli box, or two of them being made up into a worm farm. So you don't have to necessarily go out there and spend money on making your own one. The bottom box is kept complete, which has been cut down by about a third, and that collects all of the worm tea that we talk about, or worm juice. And the top box is where the worms reside, and you start off with some peat, some koi fibre, and you start and feed the worms. You obviously need to buy worms. Composting worms are very different to the worms that we have naturally occurring in our soil, and they're meant for this particular purpose. So there are about 3 different types of worms that they use. You can buy them again through your local nursery or hardware stores. So they come in the 1,000 lot container. They're quite inexpensive. They're not that dear, and yeah, certainly a great way of being able to put them together. And you've obviously got to keep a cover over the top of them. They also like a bit of moisture, so pretty well when you feed your worms, you want to spray them with a little bit of water, and put something like an old towel or an old tea towel would be ideal over the top of what you feed them. They don't like sunlight, which is probably one of the reasons why, if you've got gardens that don't have mulch on them and you wonder where the worms are, that's why they're not there, because they don't like the sunlight, so they therefore don't come to the surface. So when you're digging down into your soil and you don't see worms, that's why. So you put a cover over the top of them, just like in a worm farm. When you pull back the cover, the worms are directly underneath the cover. So when you put mulch on your garden, when you pull back the mulch, the worms are there. So let that be a lesson for any of you that are a bit bewildered as to why you don't have worms in your gardens. So the 3 different types of worms that they have are night crawlers, red regulars, and tiger worms, they're called. And as I say, they generally are sold in a 1,000 lot container. Some you can buy a kit, as a matter of fact, and some councils again subsidise these kits. I know here in Wyndham, a mob called Worm Lovers supply quite a lot of the different councils with worm farms. Anyway, worms will eat just about anything, but they dislike citrus and onion, like I explained before. So things like garlic, onion, even leeks I wouldn't put in there, and any citrus skins or flesh don't put in there. They don't like it, but they will chew through things like eggshell, and they will also go through things like newspaper and the like. So that's not really an issue, but you've got to shred it and you've got to make sure you wet the paper. Don't just put it in there dry. As you'll be aware, they have quite a moist skin, and they often never dry, and They don't like to be dry, so it's important that you keep them moist. I've discussed the blanket over the top, but as I say, you could make you could use layers of newspaper moistened up as the top rather than the towel if you wanted to. Worms will not eat if it gets either too hot or too cold, and in fact they'll die under those circumstances. So the ideal temperature that you want to try and keep your worms at is around about 18 to 24 degrees. Now they'll suffer down to sort of about 5 or 6, but they're not very active at that point. That's why I say that things like, a garage or, and they don't smell, by the way. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, a good composter or a worm farm will not smell. And if you can smell them, there's often something wrong. You've got something off in balance. And just like the compost, you would put what you're putting in your worm farm in layers as you put it in. So you could have it near the back door, so it was convenient. So that when you're having to travel miles or travel a long way to go put your scraps where they're needed. So over the winter months, you obviously need to keep it in a warm position, and in the summer months you need to keep it in a cooler position. So you got to consider those things when you're looking to put one in. Now there are some larger type worm farms about, and this is a more industrial size one, probably something like you could probably well do with over there at the community garden. Waste around things like the cabbage and broccoli and the like that you could be throwing this into for sure. So now the bottom box or that bottom tray, and let's go back to this other slide here. That bottom tray at the bottom collects not only the worm castings but the worm tea. And the worm tea, a lot of people think that it's fertilizer, but it's actually not. It's a soil conditioner. The worms, by the time the worms drop their castings, there's pretty well no goodness left in what they leave behind. But when I say in terms of food, because they've nourished all themselves by eating what they've consumed. But what they've left behind is full of vital microflora for good soil health, and that's really important. Some of that bacteria and so forth is also vital in composting. So it's absolutely ideal to use in a watering can, and you dilute it to around about 9 parts water to 1 part worm tea. Don't put it on neat, and just simply water that over the top of your newly planted seedlings to act as a soil conditioner, and it actually helps with transplant shock. And encourages good root growth and builds strong and healthy plants. So but by no means don't just use it thinking that you're feeding your plants. You're not. You need a fertilizer to do that. And by the way, composting is a great addition to the soil, but it's also not a food. It will help plants grow, and it's vital for their existence, but it's not a food. Once the bacteria have broken that food down, most of the goodness that was in that food is gone and been turned into organic matter that is vital for soil's health. And of course, soil itself is a living thing, made up by, like I've said before, billions of bacteria, but it's also all this vital microflora that's in the soil that we can't see. You'd need microscope to see that. But it's also full of fungi and so forth, which is really important for good soil health. Now the castings can be collected at the bottom of the reservoir, which can be dug in and around your plants. Is completely safe, and it won't burn anything that you put it on, and it's very good for them. So worm castings are packed full of minerals that are obviously essential with for plant health. and it has a few things in there that are concentrated phosphorus and magnesium and potassium levels, and often calcium. But it does need to be diluted, as I say, and don't just consider that just because you put it on is going to feed your plants. It absolutely doesn't. Now, when it comes time to using your compost and you've sifted out all the big bits and pieces, as you can see, it's a great thing to be able to use around your plants. You can either just top dress over the top of your soil, and that's quite often what I do. I don't tend to dig my compost in, but once I put compost on, then I put mulch over the top of it so that the worms can come back up from in the soil to do what they do best, and that's aerate the soil, and they will continue to work on that compost. And as they create holes in the soil to aerate the soil, the compost eventually gets incorporated into the soil and becomes soil itself. But provided you've got that cover, like I said before, a bit like the worm farm, it's got to have a cover over the top of it. You don't want it to dry out. You've spent all that time and trouble to make the compost. Make sure that it does its job by making sure you cover it, just like you would the worm farm, and allow those worms to come back up from inside or from down deep in your garden to use the compost as nature intended. It's a bit like a forest floor. If you provide the forest floor with mulch, you'll get the forest soil. And of course, if you scratch back the mulch in a forest, you can dig nearly an arm's depth in a beautiful, rich, open, friable, beautiful open soil. And that's not because, we've got people there turning the soil over with pitchforks, and, the composting insects have been doing that. And they do that because they get the cover from the mulch. So, as I say, if you think about consider your garden as a forest, and start and provide that mulch layer, you'll start and get the great way of what compost and these worms and the composting insects will do for you. So I've gone through those. Again, look, you can buy compost already complete and being done by quite a lot of the councils and so forth. The hot composting tends sometimes to have a little high in alkaline, which is a bit unfortunate. So just be aware, if you're not making your own compost and it's been you purchased it, don't use too much of it in any one spot. Spread it sparingly across the top of your soil. Can you add garden worms to compost pile or bin? No, you can't. They are very different, so don't be tempted to be digging up worms from your garden and putting them into the compost. They actually, bear in mind that the food system that we have here in Australia is not native, and these worms in our soil are. So they don't take kindly much to our food product. That's why we're using these red wrigglers, the tigers and the night crawlers, because they are European primarily composting worms. So they do different things. Mind you, once the worms have completed making the compost, and what happens, what I find interesting is when I've got a compost heap on the ground, I find worms in amongst it, but I think that they tend not to do as much as the night crawlers and these other European type do when you're using the food scraps. So I think you're better off, to let the composting worms do it the way they do best. You're better off to start off with either start off with a kit or buy your own worms where you can. So I hope that answers the question. There was something else that you raised there I raised that anyway. Look, let's go to some Q&A. By the way, I have I'm the author of this book, practical guide, edible gardens, a practical guide, and this also has a good chapter on composting and worm farming. So if ever you're looking for more information, that's where you can get it. I'm certainly open to have some questions